It's looking like we, the people, will face attacks on our personal freedoms and sovereignty, not just from one side, but from two. People immediately fear the impingement of freedom by government, but we currently live in an aptly dubbed exponential age, an exponential digital age, where big tech companies have surpassed those levels of growth and pervasiveness, which will allow them to also become threats to the liberties of the people. It would be comforting if we could chalk such ideas up to the domain of conspiracy theory, but the reality is that these behemoth tech platforms may be the gravest dangers to personal liberties at any time if they fall into malevolent hands. As is too often the case, the trend implies that decentralization may be the only guarantor of freedom in the near future. Ready? Let's go. Today, we'll discuss this topic around freedom of speech, big tech social media platforms, why this is distinguishable from the past, and how decentralization might be our only hope. And then we'll touch on something very positive that happened in Las Vegas this weekend. If your first thought when you saw this image was, I don't know what you guys are so worried about, I could easily defeat that wooden fellow oppressing the other one. He doesn't even have opposable digits. Or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. When I first encountered crypto, I probably felt exactly like you did. You might have read the Bitcoin white paper, or maybe you had someone explain it to you, or maybe you just encountered crypto more generally. But at some point, you probably understood the value of decentralization. And one of the first ways in which people understand that is when someone explains to them that fiat currencies are constantly devalued and inflated by central banks. And the second you understand that cryptos can have a hard cap, and they cannot be inflated by any central bank, you suddenly understand in a very real way the value of decentralization. What I think I didn't understand the first time I read the Bitcoin white paper was how important decentralization would be to other parts of our lives as regular people in the world. There are certain things, certain freedoms we have to varying extents, depending on which government you're living under. But in a lot of the Western world, we have there's some scope to a freedom of speech. We can say certain things. And in a lot of countries, not all, but in a lot of countries, liberal Western democracies, using that word liberal in a very general sense, not a political right and left sense, but in liberal Western democracies, you have some freedom of speech. And the government, generally there's some kind of guarantee that the government won't trample your freedom of speech to some extent. It varies. In some countries, there are certain things you absolutely cannot say. In some countries, it's a much more general right to say pretty much anything you want to say. But there's usually some kind of freedom of speech in liberal Western democracies, and the government can't impinge on that freedom of speech. What we found over the last, especially the last half decade, is that government is always sort of the big fear is always that government will be the one. But what we found over the last half decade is that increasingly people are more and more worried about corporations trampling their freedom of speech. This is something historically we didn't really encounter. Even in the days of Ma Bell, which was a telephone network monopoly, even in those days, when one company controlled all of the telephone network, even in those days, there was no fear that they would censor speech. Why was that? It's because Ma Bell had no way of actually monitoring all the speech that was happening on the telephone network. They didn't have enough people, even if they manually just had people listening to the audio of every single telephone call, there wasn't enough manpower to, take notes on whatever he was saying, nor probably did anyone at the telephone company care about even exploring anything in that direction. Sure, you could probably argue there have always been wiretaps and things like that going on, but they were on a very selected basis back in those days. Fast forward to 2022, and the technological landscape looks very different. The equivalent of a mob bell can, in fact, monitor all the speech. And as you and I both know very well, they do monitor all the speech. And what ends up happening is that because they actually can monitor all the speech, there are always going to be these areas of communication that are deemed illegal, even in the most liberal Western democracies that have the most expansive freedoms of speech. There are always going to be certain things we say that people can't say. You can't go into a crowded theater and yell fire if there's no fire. That's speech. You don't have that freedom of speech to walk in there and say fire, because then people might run towards the exit, and people might get trampled, right? There's certain speech you cannot engage in always, because there's always this area of forbidden speech. Of course, these networks are going to engage in some level of censoring, because now they can. While you could have yelled fire over the telephone and no one was going to worry about it, you could call someone's house and yell, "There's a fire in your house," and there's no way for the telephone company to really monitor that. Today, if you do the equivalent, and we're not really talking about yelling fire in a movie theater, that's just an example of sort of extreme speech that ends up being forbidden. You can all imagine certain types of speech that are forbidden no matter what the platform is. And because the networks can monitor them now, they do monitor those things. But what we found over the last decade, the last decade especially, is that the things they want to censor keep expanding. At some point, the modern networks crossed a Rubicon where they decided not only would they monitor the speech that they have to monitor because it's illegal, or that they think they have to monitor because it's illegal, they would also start monitoring speech that they find to be undesirable in some way, usually labeled as harmful. If they decide that speech is harmful, even if it's not illegal, they decided they would monitor and censor that speech as well. And we run into this problem because while the entire world may think of some of these networks as more like utilities, they're really something that everybody is using. In certain countries, almost everyone is using or has used certain platforms, especially we could almost say that almost everybody has used Facebook, but of course they have sort of this fading demographic. It's skewed much, much older, while much, much younger people might be using platforms like TikTok en masse, while older demographics aren't. Definitely within age demographics, though, we have platforms that are being used by huge chunks of the population, even if we have these demographic divides between platforms. So they're almost, in a lot of ways, they're almost more like utilities. But in a lot of countries, we also have contractual rights. And of course, these private entities say, hey, we built this platform and we can decide who to have a customer service provider relationship with. This is part of the right to contract. They can sort of be in this business arrangement with any customer they want, and they can decide to exclude customers if they want. Just like any restaurant could say, hey, we're not going to allow this guy. We don't like this guy. We're not going to serve this person. So we have these conflicting rights between the social media platforms, the communication networks, their right to do business with whoever they want, provide their platform to whoever they want and not to others. That's conflicting with this freedom of speech, because when everyone is using the platform feels a lot more like a utility and less like some private company. This has led a lot of people to say that we don't have a freedom of speech problem. We have a monopoly problem. However, what we see is that we don't have a lot of anti-monopoly activity against these gigantic platforms. Maybe there is, but it never quite amounts to monopoly busting. We don't see Facebook being broken up. We don't see Twitter being broken up. We don't see Google and YouTube being broken up. Instagram not broken up. Obviously, some of these are subsidiaries of the larger social media platforms, but we don't see these gigantic social media platforms being broken up. So maybe it is that we have a monopoly problem and not a freedom of speech problem, but the monopoly problem isn't being solved. So we end up with a freedom of speech platform or problem when these platforms are basically playing the role of utility, but they are private corporations. This was already a huge and notable problem with social media platforms, where the worst punishment might be that you get kicked off the social media platform, which can be a huge problem for people who are, basically making a living on those social media platforms. But it's not the worst punishment in the world for the average person if their, breadwinning labors lie elsewhere. This weekend, we saw something different. This is an update to the acceptable use policy of PayPal. As you know, PayPal is not a social media platform. PayPal is a payments network. So it says, beginning November 3rd, PayPal is expanding their speech restriction rules. Acceptable use policy violations of the PayPal user agreement may subject you to damages, including liquidated damages of $2,500 US per violation. So the updated policy prohibits users from sending, posting, or publication of any messages, contents, or materials that in PayPal's sole discretion are harmful, obscene, harassing, or objectionable, depict, promote, or incite hatred or discrimination, are fraudulent, promote misinformation, or are otherwise unfit for publication. So they're saying PayPal could fine you $2,500, not only if you post anything that's harmful in their sole discretion, so anything that they think is harmful, which could be, let's face it, a very broad swath of different things, given the way social media platforms have labeled things harmful in the past. Definitely a lot of things that are certainly not illegal and would fall under the freedom of speech rights of most people in a lot of liberal democracies. In the past, we've seen them limit those things. But here we see them also limiting misinformation. Notice that fraudulent information and misinformation are two separate categories here. So when they say misinformation, they're not talking about things you necessarily know are false. I would read this as being something that is false, even if you didn't know it's false. So according to this policy, as it's laid out here, we're talking about the possibility of being fined $2,500 by PayPal if you post, send, or publicize any messages, content, or materials that are wrong, even if you didn't know it's wrong. This is hard to distinguish from a social credit system when you think about the fact that it's in PayPal's sole discretion. So even if you find, good robust evidence that the information was in fact correct, if it's in PayPal's sole discretion, they can fine you $2,500. Keep in mind that PayPal isn't just a service to send your friends money when you go out to the bar and you don't have any cash on you to make up for the tab they picked up or something like that. A lot of people actually make their money through PayPal. Their actual money that pays their bills all comes through PayPal. A lot of actual small businesses operate through PayPal. So if PayPal has the ability to fine these small businesses $2,500, they basically would have the ability to control all of those businesses' speech. Of course, this caused a gigantic uproar, and even former founders and leaders of PayPal, like David Marcus and Elon Musk, agreed that the new acceptable use policy goes against everything they believe in. This has been a theme we've seen over and over again with social media platforms. The founders had these ideals that seem to match up with everything that everybody's always agreed in liberal Western democracies. And then we run into sort of the people who start running the platforms after the founders are all gone. And those people immediately align the policies of the tech platform with their particular political agenda. And they cross this Rubicon. They always cross this Rubicon of where they go from only censoring speech that's illegal to censoring speech they find to be undesirable. And coincidentally, the undesirable speech always matches whatever their political agenda is. And I don't even think it matters whether they're on the right or the left. I don't care. What I care about is the fact that they're censoring this undesirable speech that's not illegal just because it conflicts with their political agenda. Of course, this news caused a lot of people to post screenshots of them closing their PayPal accounts, and PayPal seemed to respond pretty quickly with this. An AUP notice recently went out in error that included incorrect information. PayPal is not fining people for misinformation, and this language was never intended to be inserted in our policy, as if PayPal doesn't have gigantic legal teams reviewing their acceptable use policy over and over and over again, iteratively. I'm afraid this big tech monopoly thing does not work, guys, and we cannot rely on the regulators to actually do any antitrust monopoly busting. It just hasn't happened. If it was going to happen, I feel like they would have made some headway and we wouldn't be left with a small handful of big tech companies controlling so much of the communication. I think the only way out of this is for us to push decentralization forward. I think blockchain is the most promising thing on the decentralization front. So I think crypto and blockchains are probably our only way out of this mess. Otherwise, we just end up with a bunch of big tech oligarchs controlling what speech is allowed to be transmitted on basically the only networks that people are using for communication. While all of that was going on, Cardano celebrated its community and builders at CNFTCON, and a lot of great media came out of CNFTCON, which we'll probably talk about over the coming days. But I thought this topic today around what's happening with the big tech platforms and freedom of speech and what decentralization can bring to the table, I thought that was too important for us not to talk about that today. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.